Hello and welcome everyone to this, our third session of Federalism on Trial, Lessons from COVID-19. My name is Samuel Hill. I am a Senior Research Fellow and Ambassador for the Federalism Index Project, and I have the privilege of moderating our session today. This session is Federalism, COVID-19, and Political Culture. We're going to be emphasizing some of the internal, structural, and behavioral characteristics of our system and how they affect our responses to it and what we can learn from how they've been used, this system. I am joined today by a number of distinguished guests. We have Don Kettl, who is the Sid Richardson Professor at the LBJ School, specializing in public management and public policy. And he has previously served as Dean at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. He has authored or edited numerous books, including the most recent, The Divided States of America, Why Federalism Doesn't Work. And we're going to be very interested to see from him some of the shortcomings of the system that we're working within. We are also joined by Greg Goelzhauser, the Associate Professor in the Political Science Department at Utah State University. And he has published 2 books on judicial selection and has also served as co-editor of the Annual Review of American Federalism, published by Publius, the Journal of Federalism. With us also is Lance Sorenson. He is an Assistant Attorney General for the state of Utah, emphasizing constitutional law. He has taught law and history at Stanford, BYU, and UNLV, and authored articles in the American Indian Law Review and the University of Pennsylvania Journal of Constitutional Law. And finally, we have Carl Eric Scott, Adjunct Professor at Oglethorpe University, Georgia. He has taught political theory, American politics, and great books liberal arts at a number of institutions, including Washington and Lee University, Skidmore College, St. John's College, and our very own Utah Valley University. He's also written on constitutionalism, film, and rock music for the National Review online group Postmodern Conservative. So I don't know if we'll be expecting any musical contributions from him today, but we definitely are glad to have him here. That said, I would like to turn the time over to Don Kettl. The floor is yours, sir.
Thanks so much, and thanks for the chance to be able to have this conversation with all of you here today and to explore these issues of federalism. And as I've said, and as the introduction suggested, I've got a new book, The Divided States of America, but I want to, in particular, if I can actually get a shot, the scene that comes from Benjamin Franklin's cartoon. That was the famous thing that was in his almanac that showed a cartoon of a snake being sliced up into pieces. 13 different colonies, at that point becoming 13 different states. And the caption for that was "Join or Die." And that's been the basic problem that we've had ever since. To what degree can we join? To what degree do we risk dying if we don't? And what I want to try to do today is to not so much argue against the fundamentals of constitutionalism, but to really present a kind of indictment against federalism as we know it now and suggest why we need some really fundamental changes. The first point that I want to make is that in many ways, federalism was the most essential of Madison's great inventions in writing the Constitution. We tend to think of the separation of powers as the big idea, but in many ways, the biggest idea was the one that isn't explicitly in the main body of the Constitution, which is that the states created the national government. The states are really the driving power behind it, would not have worked at all unless the states decided to ratify it. And so federalism was the precondition for ensuring that the United States even came into being to begin with. Because without ultimately the 10th Amendment, which reserved powers to the states that were not explicitly put in the Constitution, there would not have been a United States of America, because the states simply would not have ratified the Constitution. If that had happened, we might well be speaking French or Spanish or who knows what other language at this point, but it's unlikely that the country would have survived if it hadn't been for Madison's great and essential invention. But on the other hand, because of that, which I think we recognize implicitly, if not at least explicitly perhaps, it's that the notion of federalism has never been a pure principle, even though we often give reverence to it. It's always been a dynamic from the very beginning, and it has never been a very stable feature in our system because we've had an evolution through the course of history, not only in the first century or so as we moved toward the basic battles that led to the Civil War, the separate but equal doctrine that was resolved with the war itself, with the 14th Amendment that created equal protection under law, but then a series of policies since that really have amounted to a tug of war between the federal government and the states ever since. So it's important to understand federalism not as a principle, but as a dynamic, and as a dynamic that's constantly been changing and whose dynamics affect the way in which the rest of us live. And that gets to my third point. The first was that it's Madison's most essential invention. The second is that it's a dynamic instead of a principle. The third is that federalism has sadly become much more of an engine of inequality. If you really want to understand the big differences in the country, and the differences especially in inequality in both income and in policy outcomes for citizens, we, to a much larger degree than we often recognize, have to look at the importance of federalism and the role of the states. Let me illustrate that with the fourth point having to do with COVID in particular. And with COVID, if you want to understand the way in which COVID has worked, in fact, COVID confusion in the United States, you have to understand it as, in so many ways, the product of federalism, in part because this, of course, was the explicit policy of the Trump administration to the degree which possible, pass authority down to the states, but also the fact that when it comes to public health, when it comes to decisions about locking down the economy, those are decisions that are made inevitably in the state capitals. And so the way in which the states have reacted to this can give you a pretty good guide about the way in which federalism works these days. And if you look at the whole pattern of the way in which the states responded, it's important to understand that what happened and the way the governors decided turned out to be embedded in a much larger fabric of federalism that had been going on for a very long time. That in many ways, the story of federalism since the 1960s has been an effort just at the very time when we thought, finally, we have some understanding about the relative authority of the federal government and the states. We now have a position, for better or worse, where the states are in many ways going their own way, and they're going different ways. The fundamental differences between the states, the differences between the states is growing, and those differences in turn are fueling an economy and fueling inequality in the country. So a couple of things in particular. The first is that why is it the states behave differently? Look at April 1st as a basic breakdown of the decision to lock down the economies or not, if we go back in time to that point. There were a fair number of states, about 2/3, that decided to lock down by then, and others that decided to lock down afterwards. Of the states that locked down in March, it turns out that public health spending per capita in those states was 44% higher than the states that locked down afterwards. Not a cause and effect, but rather an argument that this is all part of a much broader policy stream. So the states that acted more aggressively dealing with COVID were also the states that more aggressively had been working on issues of public health previously. The states that locked down earlier in March tended to have, and I looked across the board at a whole collection of policy outcomes, they tended to have much better outcomes for the environment, for infant mortality, for 8th grade reading, for poverty, and even for the number of deficient bridges. So if you want to understand why it is that some states locked down earlier, it turns out that it was not connected nearly as much to the outbreak of the virus as it was an ongoing pattern of policy decisions that had been in place for a very long time. Very deep policy decisions that in many ways have been aggravated and widened in the time since. Then in addition to that, we have to understand that as the states have responded, they've responded not only in different ways, but in ways have succeeded in driving, because of these policy inequalities, different political polarization as a result of this. That states increasingly are different, and their differences are widening across this whole collection of indicators. What difference does this make for the country as a whole and for the country's place in the rest of the world? Because we could argue that states just have the right to be able to make their own decisions, but it turns out that the government that we get increasingly depends on where we live. And so that's an important issue to begin with. But in addition, even federal systems in other parts of the world have dealt with the COVID virus much more successfully than we have, because the death rate in the United States is higher than in any other federal system anywhere else in the world. So it turns out that federalism as a structure makes an enormous difference. Makes an enormous difference because the kind of government we get depends increasingly on where we live, that the differences among the states is significant, that those differences are growing, and that the frictions among the states are then, as a nation as a whole, producing outcomes that are significantly worse than in many other countries that also have federal systems. There's something that's peculiar and especially, unfortunately, pernicious about American federalism. Now, this isn't an argument to try to blow up all of what it is that Madison and the founders put together, but it is an argument for reassessing it. Reassessing it, I think, importantly, because first, these policy outcomes really matter. Secondly, it's the case that the differences are growing, and as they continue to grow, they're putting increasing friction into the system. These frictions are leading to increasing polarization, which is not healthy for our country. And that means, I think, an argument not for abandoning federalism, but for finding a way to fundamentally rework it. And what might that mean? It'd mean, I think, revisiting the question of exactly how power gets distributed. As we've learned in COVID, there's some things that the federal government, by necessity, needs to do if we're going to have an adequate system of response as well as preparedness to big issues. We need, for example, to think about, when it comes to COVID, defining what the problem is, developing a system of measures so that at least we can keep score on a uniform basis, which we don't have right now. In fact, the closest thing we have to a national scorecard isn't even kept by government, but is kept by Johns Hopkins at this point, which is a sign of the deep problem in which we find ourselves. The United States is unique in the world in the fact that it's a nonprofit organization that's in charge of the basic scorekeeping in the system. We need best practices that we can identify to stop the spread. And as we're about to find, especially when it comes to distribution of a vaccine, we're going to need a strong government role for figuring out where that ought to be. We need, in fact, a strong federal government role in some cases if we're going to be able to solve these problems. There's plenty of room for state variation, state experimentation, and state implementation for sure, but those issues that have to do with national policies needs to have a national stamp on them. What this really means, I think, is a kind of shift to something that is much more Hamiltonian in its construction than Madisonian. And it means, I think, probably on top of that, a shift in the way in which power is distributed. This is not to say that we need to do away with local self-government. There's lots of room for doing that. And in fact, and I don't think I'd find any support for this idea, but there are those things that need to be national in terms of policy and scope. That has to do with basics, having to do with poverty and with health. But there are other issues that I think maybe not so much, including, for example, infrastructure. There, the Democrats certainly would not agree. The Republicans wouldn't agree with the first, and I find myself probably in a majority of one, maybe in support of this. But the fact is that we've made some serious problems for ourselves by having a series of patterns of decisions that in fact have served to aggravate inequality in America. Why this matters is that if we allow inequality to continue as it has, it will continue to eat away at the very basic fiber of our governance structures. And a large part of the inequality that we have is rooted in federalism. If we're interested in trying to restore political stability, we have to try to reduce that polarization. And if we're interested in trying to reduce polarization, we have to reduce inequality among the states. And if we're interested in doing that, we need to revisit the basic principles of federalism on which this country has been founded. So I'll stop there with hope, having stirred up enough debate to be able to keep us going for a while. But these are fundamentally important issues.
Thank you very much, Don. I appreciate that. That was fascinating and interesting. And I think it'll be increasingly interesting to contemplate what sort of roles the different governments will be taking as we move into the future in sort of this post-COVID era. Thank you very much. We will now be moving to Greg Goelzhauser. Greg, actually, I have to apologize. How do you pronounce your last name?
Goelzhauser, yeah.
Goelzhauser, okay, I got it right. Very good. So we'll be moving to Greg Goelzhauser and his Polarization in Federal Systems. Greg, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So, of course, it's well known that there's an increasing degree of polarization in the US. some areas comparatively have seen a dampening of polarization in light of the pandemic, for example, Chile. Others have seen polarization impact the government and public response and perhaps exacerbate the effect of polarization. The US probably falls into that category. Academic journals are quickly being filled with studies about partisan divergence with respect to the pandemic, using things like location tracking data to show differences in travel, beliefs about the prevalence of the virus and the dangers associated with the virus, preferences concerning things like business closures, social distancing, gathering limitations, and so forth. Interestingly, initially, there was some indication that federalism may have helped to mitigate the effect of polarization on pandemic perspectives, with people of different perspectives agreeing more on the validity of protective measures adopted in their own state than on the validity of the broader national response. But it's not clear the extent to which that sort of convergence held over the long term. At the same time, outside of the pandemic context, we've seen mounting polarization with respect to federalism more broadly. So perspectives on the balance of state and federal power depend often on the party in control at the federal and state levels. If the federal government is controlled by co-partisans, support is often higher on average for federal intervention. Whereas if the federal government is controlled by the other party, then there's retreat to the state and local level to thwart national policy implementation. And so as party control changes, perspectives on federalism shift with those changes. If that's right, then federalism, there's a risk that federalism becomes just a tool in the partisan toolkit. And David Kaniski and I have a paper that demonstrates an increasing prevalence in using federalism punitively to threaten and punish one's political opponents. So again, it's not discussion about federalism for its own sake. It's the extent to which federalism can be used as a partisan tool to threaten and punish ones that you disagree with on policy matters. And this punitive federalism has important implications for how people will evaluate fundamental questions concerning the balance of state and federal power going forward. So the pandemic is playing out amidst this broader backdrop concerning the intersection between polarization and federalism. And with respect to federalism and the pandemic in particular, debate is ongoing about whether decentralized power is good for pandemic management. And it turns out this is a really difficult question for a couple of reasons. As an initial matter, the pandemic imposes a unique coordination problem, of course, that arguably calls for a centralized response. And so some have argued as a result of that, that decentralized power is a bad thing for the pandemic. But what if the centralized response is ineffective? Then a system of federalism that prohibits federal preemption permits at least some jurisdictions to implement an effective public health response. Though, of course, the extent to which one jurisdiction can be successful in mitigating the negative public health impacts of the pandemic is constrained by spillover effects across jurisdictions, the horizontal federalism problem. And what too if there's heterogeneity with respect to the perceived trade-off between public health and other pandemic consequences, such as economic decline and restrictions on civil liberties? Or what if there's disagreement about what an effective response looks like? The very concept of an effective response, which is essential to nail down for clarity when evaluating the impact of federalism on the pandemic, assumes common ground with respect to the extent to which there is a problem and how or whether to manage that problem through government. And this is where polarization, federalism, and the pandemic collide, because polarization drives those perceptions about the nature of the problem, how or whether to manage the problem, and how to trade off public health effects against other considerations such as economic decline and restrictions on liberty. Thus, it seems difficult to say anything objectively definitive about federalism and the pandemic without viewing the issue through the lens of polarization. One broad question we might consider then is there a way to preserve the concept of federalism in a way that leaves room for good faith debate about the appropriate balance of state and federal power while keeping the core constitutional principle from being just another part of the political toolkit? And with respect to federalism, polarization, and the pandemic in particular, that intersection, is there a way to evaluate the impact of federalism on the pandemic in a way that it is non-binary and open to institutional solutions that balance some central authority to help solve coordination and spillover problems with local authority to adapt measures at a more micro level to varying facts on the ground? Or does the influence of polarization mean that the only relevant question is whether we agree with the broader bundle of social and economic policies on offer from the party in control of either the federal, state, or local jurisdictions? And then discussion about federalism and polarization in the pandemic also have to address additional questions, like in federalism's favor, the possibility that decentralized solutions may, at least as initially indicated to some degree by public polling data, dampen the effect of polarization. But in opposition to federalism, perhaps the possibility that decentralized solutions exacerbate inequalities with respect to things like public health risks. So this intersection between federalism, polarization, and the pandemic is an interesting one, both for purposes of managing the immediate public health crisis, but also in a way that raised fundamental questions about how federalism is viewed and will continue to be viewed moving forward, whether that core constitutional principle can be debated, continue to be debated in good faith, or whether it just gets sucked into the broader political playbook that then gets used for partisan ends. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg. Having listened to both yours and Don's talks today, I want to make sure that when we do get to Q&A, I think we're going to have space for an interesting discussion on how polarization in various locations leads to a difference in an opinion of what a correct response looks like, what an effective response looks like, what an acceptable outcome looks like. And polarization has been a major theme, I think, in a lot of what we're seeing. So I'll make sure to get that back into our discussion here in just a little bit. Thank you. Moving forward, Lance, you're up. We're going to be hearing his 2 cheers for federalism in 2020. So Lance, you have the floor.
Okay. Thank you, Sam, and thank you to these 2 presenters who have kicked things off. And you will be hearing a little bit about my 2 cheers for federalism, but probably more so about the 1 cheer that I'm withholding, and understanding that we're all allotted 3 cheers to give. But first, I just wanted to say thank you to the Center for putting this on, and to Andrew and Scott and Kari and their team. And if I could just take a moment to thank Rod Smith, may he rest in peace. He did a lot to get this center going, and I am grateful for all the work that he did to do so. Yeah, the title for my presentation is 2 cheers for federalism during the pandemic of 2020. With respect to the 2 cheers that I am giving, I will just say a couple of brief words so I can focus more on my critique. And that is that I think it's a good thing that we have general police powers located in governors rather than the president. I think it's a good thing that there's not a single national policy with respect to public health orders, including mask mandates. I think it's a good thing that there's not a single national policy with respect to school reopenings. I see no reason why a rural school district of North Dakota should open on the same terms as that of New York City or Los Angeles Unified School District. A national policy on schools, whatever it may be, has the potential to wreak devastation on the ability of local schools to act in the best interest of their students, teachers, and staff. And I say all this not just as a throat-clearing exercise, but to underscore that many of the usual reasons that some of us praise federalism during normal times apply also during a pandemic, that local governments are more responsive and therefore more accountable to the needs of their constituents. Allowing local responses permits and even encourages innovation and creativity, which I think is essential in a pandemic. Federalism allows foot voting, and I think there's probably an underreported story so far of this pandemic and the number of people who are moving to get their kids into different schools. The nation is large and diverse, and its diversity is reflected not just in traditional metrics of race and ethnicity and religion, but in other things like population density, climate, modes of transportation, family structure, economies, and many other factors that may affect virus transmission in particular, and the pandemic in general. So for these reasons, I give 2 cheers to federalism in 2020. So what about the 1 cheer that I'm withholding? And this is not so much a critique of American federalism in theory, but it is a critique of American federalism in practice. And in this, I echo what Professor Kettl said, that American federalism has never been static. It's something that has been negotiated and renegotiated throughout the country's history. And I think the United States has 2 favorite pastimes. One is baseball and the other is arguing about the boundaries of federalism. So the critique I have has to do with the ambiguous nature of Native American tribal sovereignty in our constitutional history and current practice. And my argument today is that when it comes to recognizing and respecting Native American tribal sovereignty, we have strayed from the constitutional framework, and the pandemic is an illustration of why this departure from the Constitution works to the detriment of the tribes. Some Native American tribes have been particularly hard hit by the pandemic. The Navajo Nation, for example, has a population less than that of any state, but as of a couple of months ago, had recorded a higher number of COVID-19 deaths than 16 states. It has also had, at one time or another, the highest infection rate in the entire nation. One major problem many tribes have faced during this past summer was getting access to CDC data that was widely available to state health agencies. Both CDC and state health departments noted that they weren't sure what, if any, data they could share with tribes because of the unclear nature of tribal sovereignty and government, at least in their minds. The initial decision not to share data with tribal governments and tribal health officials hampered their ability to do contact tracing and adopt other public health measures. So the coronavirus pandemic has once again revealed the ambiguous political nature of indigenous tribes and nations in our constitutional system. So how did we get here? There is, I think, a misconception that in our federal system, sovereignty is divided between 2 layers of government, the national government and the states. However, the Constitution recognizes at least 3 sovereign entities within the borders of the United States: the national government, state governments, and tribal governments. For example, the Indian Commerce Clause is an explicit constitutional acknowledgement of sovereign tribal entities. Part of Congress's enumerated powers to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the states and with the Indian tribes. That is, Congress regulates trade with and among sovereign entities, and one set of those entities is Indian tribes. Likewise, the 14th Amendment preserves tribal sovereignty even as it adjusted the sovereign relationship between the national government and the states. It did so by explicitly recognizing that there are persons in the United States not subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Previously, casual observers thought that this applied to the children of foreign diplomats, but more recent scholarship demonstrates that it was and is a recognition of continued tribal sovereignty after the Civil War. The United States' interaction with tribal nations can be divided into roughly 5 broad historical periods. And since I have my background is in history, I'll touch on these quickly to talk about how we got to this point where tribes are being left out of the federalism picture. From sometime not long after the founding through the 1840s was the removal period, in which the United States sought to relocate tribes out of southeastern states into what the United States called Indian country, which was west of the Mississippi River. Interestingly, Andrew Jackson and other United States leaders who advocated removal insisted on formalizing these forced migrations with treaties. And to be certain, the removal treaties were not negotiated by nations with equal bargaining power, but rather at the end of a rifle. But the fact that they were signed at all indicates that the United States still considered tribes to be sovereign entities. In the 1850s, the United States began a reservation period, forcing tribes to locate onto reservations, again using forced treaty signing as they understood would happen when one nation conquered but did not extinguish another sovereign nation. In 1871, as part of the resolution of an intra-house dispute in Congress over choosing where to put Western railroads, Congress ended the practice of negotiating with tribes through treaty making. Some scholars and jurists, such as Justice Clarence Thomas, see the end of treaty making with the tribes as the end of tribal sovereignty. However, subsequent history does not bear this view out. And I'll get to that in just a second, but I'll note that from the 1880s until the 1950s, Congress adopted a series of often contradictory measures aimed at stamping out tribal sovereignty altogether and fully assimilating American Indians into what you might call a progressive vision of American mainstream society. These measures included a policy of allotment and settlement into agricultural pursuits, promoting Christian boarding schools, and having either the federal government or state governments assume full control over Indian criminal and civil justice. That was trying to get rid of internal Indian justice systems. Despite all this, the United States nevertheless undertook some efforts to preserve tribal culture and heritage, most notably by Franklin Roosevelt's Commissioner of Indian Affairs, John Collier. Okay, if you're ready for the whiplash, here it is. By the end of the 1960s, though, after a worldwide movement for self-governance among indigenous groups, Congress reversed course and instead of pushing for the elimination of tribal sovereignty, sought to fully recognize tribal sovereignty. This change in policy has been supported by all United States presidents from Nixon to Obama. That is, each American president in the modern era has recognized the, quote, nation-to-nation relationship between the United States and its indigenous tribes. Nixon and Reagan in particular sought to include tribal nations as part of the federal structure of the United States, seeking to decentralize power out of Washington, D.C. Perhaps counterintuitively, the branch of the federal government most hostile to tribal sovereignty since the 1960s is the judicial branch. Usually, the judicial branch is depicted in the scholarly literature as well as in pop culture as the branch of government protecting the interest of discrete minorities against the tyranny of the majority. However, when it comes to tribal sovereignty, the Supreme Court has, since the early 1970s, demonstrated a certain amount of hostility to the concept. For example, and perhaps most egregiously, the Supreme Court has assumed for itself the power to de-recognize tribal sovereignty through a judicially created doctrine known as implicit divestiture. Implicit divestiture is the doctrine that the tribes might lose their aboriginal sovereignty over time, not only through treaty or statute, but implicitly in a historical process that judges are somehow able to ascertain just from sitting on the bench. For example, the Supreme Court has held through this doctrine that tribes do not have criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians, do not have criminal jurisdiction over non-member Indians, do not have regulatory authority over non-Indians on reservations, do not have civil jurisdiction over torts claims between non-members on reservations, do not have the power to tax non-members on non-Indian land within a reservation, and do not have the jurisdiction to review the sale of non-Indian land within a reservation. In all of these cases, the Supreme Court used an implicit divestiture framework to find that the tribes had been divested of various sovereign powers that autonomous states normally exercise, on the basis that such powers were, according to the court, inconsistent with tribes' status and not essential to their health and safety and welfare. And in all of these cases, Congress and the executive branch had been silent on the specific issue before the court. In the absence of a clear statement from the political branches affirming or derecognizing these aspects of tribal sovereignty, the court proceeded to derecognize them through judicial fiat. The court engaged then in a form of judicial conquest of the tribes. This has led to confusion in the ranks as to whether any one of the 567 federally recognized tribal entities is truly sovereign. Given the Supreme Court's actions, it's no wonder that the CDC and state health agencies have some confusion over the status and jurisdiction of tribal governments. The constitutional power to recognize any entity as sovereign or not is clearly vested in the political branches, not in the judicial branch. The executive branch has an incredible amount of discretion to conduct foreign policy on behalf of the nation. And when it comes to dealing with sovereign tribes, which is not exactly a foreign policy per se, Congress has constitutional power as well. Nowhere in the Constitution, however, is power vested in the judiciary to use this recognition power in order to strip tribes of sovereignty. With the addition of Justice Gorsuch to the Supreme Court in 2017, who I'll note is the only Western judge on the Supreme Court, the court may have started moving in the right direction. For example, just this last term, the court issued something of a course correction in a case called McGirt v. Oklahoma. In that case, the court was asked to effectively disestablish an Indian reservation that had been created through treaty back in the 1800s, even though Congress had never given a clear indication of whether it wanted the reservation to be disestablished. In effect, the court was being asked to read the tea leaves as to what the relationship between the United States and several tribes should be. The court refused to do so and put the responsibility of clarifying that relationship back on Congress, where it belongs. The court said, quote, "Today we are asked whether these treaties promised remain an Indian reservation for purposes of federal law. Because Congress has not said otherwise, we hold the government to its word." This readjustment of federal interaction with the tribes is truer, I think, to the federalism envisioned by the founders. Congress and the president are better situated than the courts to negotiate the extent of tribal sovereignty with the tribes. Getting back to that version of federalism will still take work. The political branches must reaffirm their commitment to working with the tribes and making sure all government agencies, such as the CDC, are on board. In the end, such clarity regarding tribal sovereignty would benefit the tribes as they deal with public health crises and other aspects of governance. And as I think I mentioned at the outset, this critique of one aspect of American federalism is aimed at a practice, implicit divestiture, that has been adopted over time that I think goes contrary to the constitutional structure, which is to say that the appropriate structure is already laid out for us in the Constitution when it comes to tribal sovereignty. We just need to use it. And with that, Sam, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lance. At my house and my home, we have a number of friends of various indigenous peoples from across the country. And it's very interesting seeing some of their different reactions to the McGirt ruling. And I think even who cited where with the McGirt ruling alone is worth a lot more introspection and research. So thank you very much for that. Moving now to our final speaker, we will go to Carl Scott. Carl, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, everyone. It's been a very informative and useful panel. I want to thank Andy, the Utah Federalism Commission, for this opportunity to talk to you. My training, I mean, I've done some work in constitutional issues, but as a scholar, my training is focused on political theory. And so I've got all the weirdness coming your way that you would expect from a political theorist. I've written a paper for this conference. I'd say about 2/3 done, 3/4 done. If you'd like a copy of it, I'd be happy to send you it. I do a number of things in the paper. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but the thing I'm going to do today is sort of give you 3 sort of pieces, and you'll sort of see how they go together. I'm going to wear 3 hats. I'm going to be, on all these hats are localist hats, and I'll explain that in a moment. The first hat I'm going to wear is that of the anti-lockdown activist. And the next one is going to be the visionary political theorist. And then finally, I'll give you the empirical advocate of baby steps. The last one of those is kind of more along the lines of typical American political science in the field of state-locality relations. All of the hats I'm wearing are localist. So what's localism in my understanding? It means someone who is for increased citizen participation at the local level, increased power and discretion for local governments. And this is vis-a-vis really the state governments, the federal governments, and we might also talk about national organizations or corporations. So the localist is not for all 3 levels of government, or 3.5 levels of government if we go with Lance's presentation of the tribes. He's not for all 3 of those, or 4 of those, their power increasing. He's for the power of local governments increasing with respect to the others. And it's because the localist is going to believe that there's a powerful case to be made that localist democracy is really the heart of democracy. This is really where democracy came from, both if we think about the historical story in ancient times, but also if we think carefully and properly with Tocqueville in hand about the American experience. So the title of this talk is Township Federalism. But I want to also, just before I get going with these 3 hats, underline the fact that someone who is for increased federalism in kind of a parallel way of the states having more power vis-a-vis the federal government, they might well be against localism. You do find many people sort of talking as if the 2 go hand in hand. It's the same kind of rhetoric of it allows greater citizen participation, more experimentation. But you could imagine a case for making the increase of state power effective, more organized. You could just say increased localism is just going to confuse things. It's going to increase opportunities for forum shopping, for what one of our panelists called punitive federalism actions. So that's certainly a possibility. All right, so hat number 1, the anti-lockdown activist who's also a localist. Couple caveats. I perfectly acknowledge that the localist democracy line of lockdown skepticism has not been typical for the movement. The more typical line by far has been an emphasis on violation of constitutional rights that the individual should enjoy. I mean, you hear it spasmodically spoken of local power, but there hasn't been, I believe, a really strong articulation of opposition to the lockdowns on the basis of localism. Also, you should know I'm kind of speaking here with the activist hat, so I'm aware that not everything I'm saying might pass muster in a scholarly sense or a journalistic sense. Feel free, if you think this, my activist is going to say something wrong, to follow up on in the question period. So here's what he says. All Americans should want their democracy to have a strong locality-based aspect, and the damage wrought by the ham-handed response of many state governments to the pandemic in 2020 has surely led more Americans to see this. In fact, I was reading the other day a real estate blog guy who's leaving California, and he was saying, you know, before 2020, I paid attention to national politics. I didn't really pay attention to state politics, local politics. I didn't think these people had the power or the ability to really affect my life. Boy, was I wrong. Yeah, okay, the activist position is we've seen some benefits of localist democracy in some states, to a small degree in Utah, but we've seen very vividly the harms of its absence in certain states like government. The governments of the rural counties of Michigan, for example, have not been permitted to carve out exceptions to various rules, such as those concerning boating, exceptions which the local leaders know are needed, and that if they're not granted, are going to tempt people to defy all of the rules. In Utah, by contrast, we've got some variation, all right? Different cities were permitted to open gyms, hair salons at different times. I had a haircut in early April, which is kind of radical for, if you look at the overall, at a salon, if you look at the overall American story, that was permitted by the governor's office for the mayor of Orem to make that choice, and that's the way he chose. However, the activist is going to admit that it's difficult sometimes to correctly distribute areas of authority between state governments and local ones. It's always going to be disputed. And even if you go to a key localist text like Tocqueville's Democracy in America, you find some room for uncertainty, right? I mean, Tocqueville says at one point, the township is, as for statewide or social duties, the township is not free to grant or refuse its cooperation. He certainly says that the township has all the rights of its individuality as it enforces decrees that come down from the state, but it's obvious how a Governor Whitmer type would interpret a passage like that. She's going to say, pandemics by their very nature concern the state as a whole. They cannot relate alone to a single township. So it's got to be the state that makes the rules. But by her reasoning, it's not just the sheriff of, say, Michigan's Alcona County that's told to go arrest some kind of boater. Alcona County's entire government is told to shut down its democratic deliberation on the situation. And why? Why shouldn't the specific regulations about whether seeds are a non-essential retail item or whether motorboat use tends to cause violation of social distancing principles, why would that be left to the locality? Couldn't we envision the state governments issuing overall principles, some black and white rules, but then making way for the localities to decide for themselves how to best implement the principles, make the prudential judgments in a democratic way? Instead, what we have generally seen is a lot of governor's office dictating, and with very little oversight usually from state legislatures. You add to that a lot of ballyhooed coordination by many governor's offices with national organizations or other governors. And it looks like the representatives of the people, the local representatives, are completely shut out of what the Hamilton song called the room where it happens, or in 2020 terms, the Zoom where it happens. Does a local teenager have an ingenious proposal for a new next to no contact team sport? Can't vote on whether to let him try to set it up. Do some Baptists want to hold a worship service in a town park? Socialists, a protest in front of a factory, so on and so forth. You can't vote on this. Doesn't matter if your locality is the one that's liable to say no or yes. No votes for you. Wait upon your governor's pronouncement. To return to the issue of like our Tocqueville passages and what's belongs properly to a locality, to a state, and where a pandemic fits in with that. If we say that a pandemic must require a large centralized response, then really we have to say, why should we stick by what the Constitution says with the police powers? This is a pandemic, it's really an emergency situation. Let's get past our attachment to the Constitution. Or let's be even more logical, right? Shouldn't it be a world government that decides how to handle this pandemic? If you resist the kind of leading of that kind of logic, you're probably someone who treasures the following insight of Tocqueville. He says, the institutions of the township are to liberty, but primary schools are to science. They put it within the reach of the people. So I think even during a pandemic, we have reason to resist the diminishment of local government power. I'm going to skip over some more rhetorical fireworks that our activist has for us. I will concede that localist democracy can cut either way with COVID-19 policies, and this might be why some of the lockdown skeptics haven't emphasized this thing. Here in Provo, for example, the town council, they actually changed their mind yesterday on this, but in late August, they implemented a mask mandate, even though they hadn't really had any. They had been kind of not doing that for many months. And so if you're for localist democracy, you've got to take the sour with the sweet. Mask mandates are very popular among small business owners for some fairly obvious reasons, pretty popular among citizens. So, I mean, there's all kinds of details here, all kinds of messiness. I get the sense that some of my fellow panelists don't like messiness, friction. I think there's enough positive goods to be found in localism that we need to work with this. We need to accept that kind of messiness and friction at that level. Okay, let's briefly put on my second hat, that of the theoretical visionary. This part of my paper is kind of a book report. I go through three theorists: Tocqueville, for obvious reasons, a fellow named Wilson Carey McWilliams. He lived from about 33 to 2005. He's got a very powerful essay that I think will become a classic in American political thought called Democracy and the Citizen. And the third one is Jane Mansbridge. She's still with us. She has a book called Beyond Adversary Democracy. And it is excellent. It features kind of some theoretical musings about what adversary democracy is, as opposed to her concept of unitary democracy. But it also features sort of two soak and poke sociological investigations of a Vermont town that's run by a town meeting, and a kind of democracy at a kind of workplace level. So there's a lot of rich stuff in this section of the paper that I'm going to skip over, but I think that it's thinkers like these that can give you a vivid sense of why why localist democracy is important, why it's something that you might sacrifice a little bit for in one area in order to protect. Finally, and I know I'm going to go maybe slightly over time here, I want to put on the hat of our empirical advocate of baby steps. One of the frustrations I often have with my fellow political theorists who are localists, who say they're pro-localist, such as the writers for the website and organization Front Porch Republic, is that they never really get down to brass tacks, and they don't really give us what I call baby steps of what we can do. In writing this paper, I came across this book by David Berman. He's a emeritus professor at ASU and a research fellow, Local Governments in the States. It's quite recent. And I just, as someone not so familiar with the field of state-local relations, I found it invaluable. Let me give you a few tidbits of what he establishes is the case with current state-local relations that might be relevant. And let me give you a few of his possible suggestions, baby steps we could glean from his account. First of all, there's there's three levels of interactions, right? And it's not, as I sort of already said, it's not necessarily the case that the state level and local level people are going to be in agreement that, hey, federal government, you need to, leave us be. There's powerful incentives for state actors to be worried about what the localities are doing. And there have been times in our history where there's kind of been a pattern of a locality federal government alliance against the states. Second, there can be lots of incentives for local politicians to not be localists. There's a theory called the growth machine that might give them the incentive to serve those interests. There's the incentives of partisan state level politics. How can I be a good Utah Republican or a good Utah Democrat so that I'll get higher office later on? Some of these local politicians have a very extractive approach to state government. How can I cut a deal that's going to send more money, usually, to my community and get points with my community? Third point is that there's kind of an inertia of cultural expectation in America that localities will have some power and they'll handle local affairs. But point number 4, if the states wanted to, they could exercise massive steamroller type moves against locality power. Those of you familiar with the Dillon rule, states are regarded, and this comes in some ways from the language of the 10th Amendment, as corporations created by the state. So maybe you don't want there to be a town of Provo anymore. Now, most state politicians will avoid that. They've got nothing to gain from it, but it's an important feature of our system to keep in mind. And this leads me maybe to my main takeaway point, is that moving forward for localism, it's got to come from public opinion. It's got to be the public that's for it, that's pressuring particularly politicians at the state level to make way for it. And you can go to Berman and find a few things that states could do to help the states out. A similar pattern that we find at the national level: pass fewer mandates, do less competition with revenue sources, maybe even promote local government by giving them some more revenue or a new revenue source in a certain way. At the really radical level, you would need to go into state constitutions and try to limit the impact of the Dillon rule interpretation of the 10th Amendment. Although usually, even when you put things in a state constitution, that has limited ability to protect state governments. The home rule pattern for localities is really kind of a function of state politicians sort of saying, I don't want to mess with that right now. But if they did want to, again, legally, they could crush the state. So I hope these 3 hats weren't too confusing for you, and I look forward to our conversation about these 4 papers. Thank you.
Carl, thank you very much. I always like listening to things about de Tocqueville. I think that our whole country could do a little bit better if we had more of his viewpoints of the importance of the town in our decision making. So thank you very much for that. All right, I have a list of questions that's longer than a page, so I consider that a good one. I'm going to start with one that seems to have the most relevance to as many topics as possible. From the audience we have, how can we reconcile political differences between those that value government giving safety versus those that value freedom to choose, I'll just say to choose liberty. And I think this this attaches to the polarization discussion where we have different views of what an effective response looks like. So this is to all of you really, so take it as you choose. How do we reconcile the differences in an increasingly polarized nation where we have groups on each end that value different things from government?
I'm happy to dive in first, and I think the simple answer is not well. That one of the things that we've discovered is that there's an inherent tension in the system that we have now between the effort to try to say, get government off our back, we want to make our own minds up, and the fact that those decisions have important implications for people living in other places. I was listening carefully to what Greg and Carl were saying in particular about not on the one hand wanting to make federalism part of a political toolkit, on the other hand, paying attention to political opinion, but it seems to be impossible to pay attention to public opinion and not have federalism be ultimately a political tool. And that's been the case, I think, since the very, very, very beginning, where federalism was essentially a political, not really a constitutional invention to solve political and not organizational problems. And I think that's the issue that we have now. So I think that the basic, in principle, these basic issues are irreconcilable. We have to find ways of reconciling them ultimately through political steps in a way that tries to sort out, for example, the question even of local government self-rule, which runs into conflict if the local government officials say that to protect our citizens, we want to have certain lockdown processes, and the governor says, no, you can't do that. And we find ourselves constantly in the process of being able to deal with this. I suggest two things here. One is that I don't think we have to make this a strict effort of line drawing between federal, state, and local governments, but rather recognize that there may be some decisions that we can put more in, say, national hands. It would be very handy if we had at least a common language to say what a virus is, what a case is, what a test is, what a positive rate is. And in fact, if you look carefully, this is very tremendously state by state, government by government, and within governments throughout the course of the entire flow of the virus. And so that's been something from the very beginning. It'd be nice at least to have a common language to talk about it, and then allow a fair amount of local discretion so that we had rural schools, for example, that operated differently than more urban ones because of different circumstances in which they find themselves. But then recognize that we really have some fundamental political questions that are at the core of this. But we've have a system that's been incredibly disorganized and a really poor fit for the problem we find ourselves. And the post-mortem after this will show that the United States has suffered grievously by comparison to many other countries because of the system that we've got. And we can do better on this, I think.
One other thing to add to this, and unfortunately, this isn't a direct answer to the question, but something to emphasize how difficult the question is that usually we're talking about political debates on not abstract subjects, but subjects that don't affect everyone as directly as this does. And there are spillover effects on both sides, right? So it's more of it's not a zero-sum game, but the fact that whichever perspective gets picked is going to really impact someone, either with respect to public health or with respect to keeping a business open, creates a tension in this discussion that we just maybe haven't seen with other sorts of issues that strike people a little more abstractly and can be put off to, well, I'll just vote for someone else the next time and go on with your day. And here maybe can't go on with your day as easily.
Thank you
I'm
very
not sure if I have too much to add to what they've said, but I would note that the process by which we arrive at the public policy addressing the pandemic might be as important as what that policy ends up being. By which I mean, I think people are far more likely to accept a policy they deem to be wrong or adverse to them if they've had some kind of input into the process. And so what system gives you that input is, I think, the sort of the main, well, let me back up. The main promise of federalism is that federalism gives an individual at a very individual level more of an opportunity to be part of the process than, say, some kind of national mandated policy. And so when you have that buy-in from people into the process, then I think they're more likely to accept the results of whatever the policy is, and in that sense can reduce that polarization or political tension.
Yeah, just to piggyback on what Lance just said, I think either greater use of locality decisions, or if you don't like that, greater use of state legislature decisions on these issues will give people a sense of that input. I think that would be a better pattern than the kind of governor's office running everything that we're tending to see.
And the one complication I'd add in here is that one of the great conflicts and tensions in dealing with COVID has been, in fact, the wide differences in different people at the local level and their opinions about what ought to be done. That restaurant owners have very different views from what school teachers have. The people who run hotels have different perspectives than those who are running public health systems. So that while I'm a huge fan of trying to make sure that we listen to people carefully, and it's undoubtedly the case that the more that we can give people a sense of ownership of the decisions, they're more likely to follow them. Simply pushing the decision down to the local level doesn't mean that we're going to be able to try to deal with these differences, because the fundamental differences we see nationally are a reflection of community by community by community by community differences throughout the country. There's no bigger battle here in Texas, where I am right now, than between the bar owners and the restaurant owners, and the bar owner and the restaurant owners on the one hand, between the IT people. The IT people can work at home, the bar owners can't, and the nature of the economy has just fundamentally been put into disarray because of the frictions between them. So pushing the decision locally doesn't resolve those. The local governments have tried to do that, and they have found themselves in conflict with the governor. And so there are differences and frictions because there are differences and frictions that exist at the most microscopic level of our society. That's one of the hardest issues that we have to reconcile here, I think.
Thank you very much for those responses. They were very illuminating. I'd like to move to a question specifically for Professor Kettl. Moving from your argument for a reassessment of federalism to specific policy, what would you advocate for in the way of policy and implementation?
One of the things that we've done is we've tended to create a kind of broad policy set of goals in Washington and pass a lot of the dirty work of implementation onto the states, often without enough money and without enough clarity and direction. And that's one of the ways in which we ended up going in so many different kinds of directions. What we need, I think, is to step back and ask ourselves, which of those things do we really want and need to be national in scope? And which of those things that are most likely to try to help to drive a national agenda, which things are decisions best made at the local level? And we've tended to think about this as a sorting out set of functions, but I think we need to revisit those fundamentally. When it comes to COVID, as I suggested, I think that we would have been much better off had we had first a set of a clear definition of the problem. That is, what is a COVID and how is it spreads? This is not something that really is subject to local opinion, but it's something that scientists have, and allowing our best experts to try to sort that out would help. Secondly, creating a kind of national language of measuring and tracking and creating a national dashboard to be able to drive the process, so we have some uniformity and being able to understand and trying to figure out how to deal with that. Third, a set of best practices, so we understand that if in fact it turns out that washing our hands, wearing masks, and social distancing matters, then we have clear communication of that from a national level to try to deal with that. And then fourth, when it has to do with the allocation of really scarce resources like personal protective equipment, we don't have an unseemly battle among the states fighting for the same pieces of equipment, bidding up the prices, and in some cases having states bidding against FEMA. Those are all steps that I think would help on the policy front. On the other hand, the question of, given all that, should a local school district open? That's not a decision that in any way ought to be done by Washington. It's something that we could use those basic national tools to make at the local level and create the kind of buy-in that we want. So I think it's not a matter of let's put COVID in federal hands, let's put COVID in state hands or local hands, but in trying to figure out which kinds of decisions are best made in which places, and more generally to ask ourselves if there are basic issues that have to do with inequality in the country, that those are things that are best dealt with at the national level, things that have to do with the application of local values to local issues, and that could have everything to do from infrastructure to housing to education, that those are things I think best done at the local level as well. So I think that we need a more sophisticated sorting out, driven especially by what it takes to be able to make things actually work effectively.
So if nothing else, a little more clarity on what we're working on together would, I think, be very beneficial for all of us, it seems. Okay, thank you. A question for Lance. So in Griswold v. Connecticut, we get this idea that there are rights found in penumbras, in these sort of shady places between the clear letters of the Constitution. But now we have the court coming out and saying, look, you didn't specifically tell us to do this. What does that mean in terms of the shift in the judiciary from this more hostile stance to what in McGirt seems like a fairly friendly stance toward Native American sovereignties and their ability to control themselves?
First, I think it's a reflection of the value of having at least one Western judge on the Supreme Court who I think really is more sensitive to tribal issues than other members of the court who have kind of that Northeast worldview. I think, and I'm happy to discuss with anyone who feels otherwise, I think the McGirt decision was the right decision. It was moving the court and the country in the right direction because prior to it, the court had essentially adopted a view that any Aboriginal sovereignty, any Native sovereignty that has not been specifically retained as identified by Congress was somehow lost. And that just seems to me going way beyond what judges are supposed to be doing. They're supposed to allow the political branches to deal with foreign entities and domestic dependent sovereigns like Native American tribes. So by the court coming back and saying, hey, this really isn't our decision. This is Congress's call to say whether this reservation still exists or not. And we're going to assume that it does, unless Congress has clearly said that it doesn't, is sort of rebalancing in the right way how the relationship between the United States and the tribe should be arranged and negotiated and settled. I don't think they've gone all the way yet because there's since the 1970s, a whole host of Supreme Court decisions, which I talked about. But I think it does reflect in a broader sense, perhaps a little bit more judicial humility on what a judge is supposed to be doing in the court system, and maybe the court starting to confine itself to cases and controversies and to settling disputes and the things that the Constitution says courts are supposed to do.
Thank you. And moving from that idea and to something a little more generally, so you can all field this question and take your turn. How can we be more aware, and how can we address their issues of those groups that federalism seems to pass by, such as Native Americans, and I think any of the other minorities where their needs or desires may be less conventional to the constitutional mindset?
I think it's worth looking back historically to understand how much of inequality and the efforts to try to deal with it, inequality in terms of both of outcomes, but also in terms of participation, to have been rooted in federalism. Slavery was constitutionally enshrined from the very beginning, and done so not as a matter of principle, but as a matter of politics. The 3/5 rule at the early debates were, as it turns out, it was a way to try to balance power between the North and the South to provide the proper representation in the House of Representatives. So that there was an ugly calculation that produced the proper political balance, without which it would have been impossible to ratify the Constitution. There was, as a result of that, the struggles over the Civil War, over whether or not slavery ought to endure. And after that, there was separate but equal as a doctrine as well. Again, put and enshrined in federalism and carried out by the actions of states. Turns out that we've learned one thing, which is that the left to their own devices, not surprisingly, state and local governments go in lots and lots of different directions. If there are some things we want to have done on a uniform basis, on an equal basis, that calls out for federal action. Doesn't mean the federal government has to insert itself into everything, but anything that requires national outcomes in a uniform way, for example, on civil rights or in providing equal protection to everything from Native American tribes to minorities within our communities, that's something that requires national action. So the issue of our age is trying to figure out how those things that we want to try to make sure, in fact, are uniform, are things that we can speak to uniformly without creating an oppressive national regime that then destroys individual freedom in the process. That's really the fundamental issue that we face right now. And it's, I think, that one of the frictions that we see at the core of so many of our big and fundamental and searching national debates right now.
If I could jump in here, I guess I would suggest that we should be thinking also about the groups that are unorganized and voiceless. They might be minority, they might be in some way majority. I mean, from an interest group politics perspective, one of the scary things is when there's a group that maybe ought to be defending its interests, but it doesn't even really recognize itself as a group. I mean, I've been struck in this pandemic, for example, younger people. Young people don't really have anyone fighting for their interests. And I'm certainly for, in 2020, a golden rule approach to political rhetoric, despite some of the heat that my activists gave us earlier. I think it's very important not to be going around calling people despots willy-nilly, and or you want people to die because you're not wearing your mask kind of thing. That's really bad, and everyone should avoid that. But I'm for, as you can probably tell, a bit more open debate, open friction. And part of the benefits, I think, is that some groups, whether they're minority or whatever, that are not really having their interests defended, that the friction itself might make them realize, hey, wait a second, it's not just this simple story that's coming to me from, my governor's office propaganda billboards or the latest news story that emphasizes case numbers. There's something about my generation or my group where, or I don't know, think about, nursing home, people in nursing homes. I would like there to be a bit more give and take and discussion. And I think that would wind up actually protecting groups that are vulnerable more.
I'd like to go off of that for a second, Carl, and your idea of kind of a golden rule setting for discussing some of these. We actually had a question that says, could you respond to those who would argue that localism enables one town's negligence to endanger towns and neighborhoods and groups around them? How does that work with the idea of a golden rule framework?
Tocqueville, at one point, he's sort of channeling something Hume says, that there's this great maxim, you let the individual, that's being affected by a certain decision, you let him make the decision. He's the best judge of his own interests. And he steps up from the individual. He says that also applies to the family. It's the best judge of its interests. To the locality, it's the best judge of its interests, and so on to the state. Okay. But Tocqueville is aware of the fact that however nice the maxim sounds, it's technically not true. A locality might make a very stupid decision that harms it, and it could indeed harm others around it, particularly in a pandemic. So I think if you are going to be a defender of localist democracy, again, you've got to take the sour with the sweet. And I'm perfectly open to the idea that some pandemics, I'm not sure if this was one of them, might be so severe that the state has a duty to kind of shut down certain kinds of localist deliberations, right? We certainly don't want a locale, if it's the bubonic plague, we don't want a locality doing something really stupid that's going to just spread that.
If I could just frame the dilemma we have in this case with one word, that's Sturgis. If you look at the gathering of motorcycle riders in Sturgis back a couple months ago, it is now clear that, and we can debate whether or not this is on the bubonic plague scale or not, but that the decision to allow such a large group of people with a mask-free, sanitation-free, no social distancing environment has created the single biggest super spreader event in the United States so far in the course of the disease. And some experts suggest the biggest single super spreader outbreak in the course of the disease worldwide. So the question, and I'm not sure what I know the answer to this is, but the question is, to what degree should we allow the decisions of individual local governments and a group of people who decide on their own to exercise their freedom to do something that so clearly endangers the broader public health and safety? And so that really raises the question about the balance between individual freedoms and local responsibility, local self-government, and the broader national implications of some of these issues. And it's very clear that what we have here is a set of almost impossible dilemmas on this, but it is clear with COVID that it shines a bright light on some of these broader questions about just to the degree to which the decisions of individual neighborhoods, individual communities, individual cities, individual states run the risk of endangering the health and safety of others who live elsewhere. Since we have a disease that could be spread by somebody touching a doorknob or coughing into a restroom at a convenience store driving from state to state, or by what may happen inside an airplane. We have these basic decisions by individuals, all under the guise of local self-government and individual freedom, that have tremendously broad implications elsewhere. And we've seen that with Sturgis, unfortunately. So the question is, what should our proper response be to that?
Real quickly, I mean, I haven't been following the Sturgis story for the last 2 weeks, so I could be behind the times, but I think broadly I disagree with your overall characterization. Second, I would just say that, I mean, I'm glad you acknowledge, Dr. Kettl, that there's going to be a balance, that the virus forces us to sort of look at these trade-offs, but I'm sure you would also acknowledge that the trade-offs can't all go one way, that there's a certain point where other values, my economic life, my social interactions with others, have to be weighed against something like a 1 in 5,000 chance of catching this disease and dying from it, depending on what class you're in. So I don't know, I'm not saying anything we haven't heard already this year, but I think there's been, at least among many of my fellow lockdown skeptics, there's been a feeling that certain narratives have been pushed in a way that in their own way are shutting down the conversation. We still are very upset about the way YouTube, at the behest of a medical organization, prevented what could have been a dialogue between doctors about the medical science. So you guys have all heard this before, but one more time, I guess I'll put it out.
All right, thank you very much for that. I think we have time for one or two more questions. I'd like to go to Greg for a moment. You mentioned the need to balance coordination when you have or situations like this, and sometimes you need centralized responses. But then we have this question of how 2020 has really highlighted the local and state governments and their roles and their powers in comparison to the central government, and it's really shifted the focus away from Washington in a somewhat unusual way. Can we maintain not just the idea of these things, but also a focus on the state and the local as a more valuable component? Or do you think that after this passes, we'll just shift straight back to, gazing at CNN all day long and staring at Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, it's a fundamental question, and I'm not sure to what extent we're beyond that in any event, given the current circumstances. But yeah, I mean, this is an event that again seems to call for a centralized response until you open the possibility that people disagree about what constitutes an effective response, and then and opening up the possibility that the centralized response isn't effective, in which case then the ability of state and local governments to make policies free from any threat of preemption is a good thing. So it's a really thorny problem, and the pandemic didn't cause any of this with respect to broader questions of federalism, but it's really shined a light on some interesting aspects of the broader discussion with respect to the balance of federal and state power. And a particularly interesting aspect of this, is we've just been talking about, is this aspect of horizontal federalism. I don't think people have really thought too much about horizontal federalism as a general matter, because at least in contemporary times, spillover effects with respect to policy aren't particularly problematic. But here we've really got an event that's raising fundamental questions about both horizontal and vertical federalism.
And let me make three concluding points, if I might. The first is a deep thanks to both the university and to all of you for a really stimulating conversation. And this has been just wildly interesting, and suggests that this is not going to end as soon as the virus does. And the second point is that I suspect that a lot of these issues are going to continue, and that in fact we're going to continue to have a basic conversation about how best to try to deal with these questions, not only in the context of individual liberty, but also the question of what kind of differences are we prepared to allow. We can't possibly end them all. And at the same time, we have some things we want to make sure are uniform. I think rather than talk about this from a basic principled point of view, which, as I suggested earlier, is never something that federalism's really been part of. It's always been in the context of the practical, that we have to try to ask what kinds of issues do we really care about that we really think ought to be uniform across the country. And so that's because there's some things that are, for example, starting with basically civil rights, and then we could go on from there to figure out where we draw the line. The last point that we're going to have to come to grips with in one way is that the system of American federalism that we have has proven incredibly expensive in human lives, that the outcomes in the United States compared to other systems of federalism and compared to other countries in terms of the death rate per 100,000 people has in fact been higher in the United States than in almost any other country, and also higher than in any other federal system. So it's not that federalism can't operate differently in different ways, but that we've paid a very high price for the way in which we've approached it. And that's something that requires, I think, a searching examination as we get to the next phase of the virus.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. This has been, as you said, a very stimulating conversation, and one that I hope we continue well past the end of this session. We hope that those of you who are joining us right now will join us again in a half an hour for Federalism, Liberty, and Public Health with Keith Whittington, Ilya Soman, and Carmel Shakar. Don, Carl, Lance, Greg, thank you very much for joining us today.